The sea never stopped speaking at storm's end. Even when the keep was quiet, even when the moon rode low and the watchman's cloak scarcely snapped in the wind, the sea kept up its blunt conversation. A ceaseless pounding at the cliffs, a rumble that crawled through the stone and up into the marrow. It made the flagstones hum underfoot. It made goblets tremble in the Lord's hall when a larger wave broke and sent a shudder through the world. Robert Baratheon had learned that language as a boy and claimed that he could name its moods: salt-bright laughter in summer, iron-gray muttering in autumn, fury in storm. Tonight it only grumbled, a heavy sound that matched the weight inside him. He stood before the long trestle table with a letter in his hand, the wax already cracked by the messengers who bore it, and a candle guttering down beside a bowl of dark cherries. The seal he turned over and over between thumb and forefinger was stamped with 3 heads, the dragon deeply cut and smoothed by much touching. It had been a long ride from King's Landing for the courier, and the man had fallen asleep in his saddle twice before Robert had even broken the wax. "We could have waited until morning," Jon Arryn said softly. His long hands were folded behind him. The Lord of the Eyrie looked deeply tired. Travel had taken him from one sun to another these last months. An old hawk that still hunted but whose feathers did not lie smooth as before. Robert laughed, but it came out as a breath more than a sound. "And left the prince to stew in his songs while I slept? Better to know what we face than dream it." He looked at Jon, then passed him to Eddard Stark, who stood by the shutters where wind sneaked through the joins and made the candle flames lean away. Eddard's face was the same as ever, carved from patience, a steadiness that had steadied Robert since boyhood. Only the eyes betrayed anything, and they were on the letter. Robert lowered his gaze and read again, although he knew the words by now, each line of the careful hand drawing itself from memory as surely as a track in the wet sand. He had read the letter thrice and would read it thrice more, not because the words would change but because his understanding of them might. Robert of House Baratheon, Lord of Storm's End and Warden of the Stormlands, I write not as crown prince nor as singer, but as a man who has seen the shape of our realm stretched thin by old pride and new neglect. What was bound has been fraying. The winds will have their will unless we mend the cloth. You know as well as I that our fathers' grudges and our sons' hunger cannot be fed on songs alone. I wish to bind north and crown in a tie that no winter can crack and no summer can slacken. With Lord Eddard's leave and yours, I ask for Lyanna Stark's hand. I do not come by stealth. I do not come by force. I come asking blessing, and I bring my own pledge. Elia remains my lady in law and love, her children mine, her rights inviolate. I ask for a second bond under rights adjusted to law and history both, that our forebears once knew. If the High Septon must frown, then let him frown at me. I will bear it. Let the old gods watch if they will. I ask for your friendship as much as your leave. I ask for your trust, though I have given you cause to question it, being a man too fond of music and minds. Yet I tell you plain, this I do for the realm. Come to Harrenhal or to Winterfell as pleases you. We will speak, not with swords, but with the clarity of men who know their own hearts. Rhaegar of House Targaryen. Robert pressed his thumb into the dragon's heads until the wax warmed and softened. He could smell tallow and sea damp and the faint, sweet, crushed scent of the cherries that had bled into the bowl. He knew the hand. He could hear the man's voice. He had stood across a list and watched the prince ride with economy and grace, in control even in a gallop, in love with a kind of order that Robert had only ever found in a hard-won brawl. He had watched that same man step down from his horse and crown Lyanna Stark with a wreath of Northbourne flowers, and the hall had breathed in as one and then out as one, and he had felt the slow burn behind his ribs. "He asks it of you," Jon Arryn murmured. "Of you in particular. Of us," Robert corrected roughly. He set the seal down and reached for a cherry without looking, crushing it between finger and thumb and licking the juice from his skin. He knows. He knows. Gods take him. Eddard Stark had not moved. "He asks what he should have asked at Harrenhal," he said, quiet enough that the sea nearly swallowed the words. "He asks what any man should ask if he wishes my sister's hand." Robert turned on him with a kind of relief, because anger was a blade he knew how to handle. Any man, he flicked the cherry stone into the fire. Any man who would do her honor, Eddard said, and there was iron in it now. You know I count you as brother, but I will not speak of her as trophy. Honor. Robert barked a laugh and then rubbed his eyes like a boy. He was huge in the lamplight, big-boned and broad, his hair a tangle from the mist, and the laugh made him look for a moment like the boy he had been when he and Eddard had shared bread and bruises in the Eyrie. And what is it to do her honor? To say yes to the Silver Prince who could have any girl and now chooses mine because the world needs mending? To clap him on the back and say there, then, we are brothers now. Take your harp and sing over my loss. You speak as if she is your loss by right, Eddard said, eyes level with his. We had an understanding, Robert, not a vow. And she is not a prize to be awarded for a man's understanding of his own heart. She has one of her own. She will speak it. Robert made a sound that might have been a curse and might have been a laugh. She will speak it, he agreed after a long moment. I'll not be the one to tell her no. I'd sooner lift Torm's End and throw it at the sea. He drew breath, came shallow. He nodded and was aware of Jon Arryn shifting like a door swinging on old hinges. We will go to Winterfell, Jon said. Best to put words in order beneath a roof that's never yet fallen. Robert pushed the letter down the table and reached for his cloak. We will, he said, and the realm will see whether it can stomach such mingling. The old gods with the dragon, the stag held between. Stag staggers, Eddard said, and his mouth twitched. And that was how they knew the worst of the storm was still out at sea. They left before dawn. The sky a dirty fleece over the black water. The road inland was a ribbon of mud and frost. The wind carried the smell of wet leaves and horses and the faint tannic bitterness of the forests that rolled away to either side. Robert rode hard because he always rode hard. Eddard rode easily, the way a man rides who intends to ride long. Jon's men kept a steady pace to spare the older lord's bones. The river crossings were cold and the inns sparse. They ate turnips and barley and a roast capon on the 7th night that tasted half of smoke and half of divine indulgence. On the 9th day, the south seemed to fall away behind them like a rumor that no longer had power to sting. The air thinned. The north rose. Winterfell announced itself first by scent. There is a smell to old stone that has drunk so many years of rain and sunlight that it exudes a restrained, loyal damp. Moss and iron, a little smoke. By then the horses' coats had grown shaggy with the chill, and the breath of men and beasts alike steamed visibly. The courtyard teemed with men in wool and women with hands reddened by the pump. Eddard swung down stiff-backed and patted his horse's neck, and the beast turned its head and blew warm, sweet air into his palm. Lyanna was in the godswood and refused to be fetched until she had had the measure of her thoughts. Her maid said so, thin and vexed but with a protectiveness that opened Robert's brow from a frown. She's with the heart tree, the girl said, and her chin lifted as if she would push back a lord with that slender horn. She told me to say she will come when the tree has done with her. Done with her? Robert repeated and then laughed despite himself. I suppose the bloody tree can hear better than I can. You will not go to her, Eddard told him at once. Let her come to the hall. We will speak there, all of us. Not in the leaves where my father will think you seek to steal my sister's mind from me the way a hunter steals a hare. I am nobody's hare, Lyanna said much later when the hall had warmed with bodies and that first hard clatter of greeting and implacable hospitality had passed. She sat on the second step of the dais, her elbows on her knees, so that her face was level with Robert's when he lowered himself to the bench. Eddard stood behind her shoulder and Jon Arryn took the seat at the end of the table where he could watch men enter and leave as if he meant to count them and remember every face. The table held venison and oatcakes and a dish of turnip greens cooked with bacon. A dog slept under the bench, twitching. Lyanna's hair was thick as a mare's mane, black and slightly wavy, the strands of it catching fire where lamplight touched. She wore a gown of dark wool and a belt too plain for a lord's daughter, leather worn soft by use. The only ornament was a thin ribbon of blue at her wrist, the kind of ribbon a girl keeps from a day in the wind. Her eyes were neither large nor small, but they were very direct, the eyes of someone who had forgotten to learn certain courtesies and therefore had not learned certain falsehoods either. "You are nobody's heir," Robert said, summoning his grin. "The one that ordinarily eased folk and was famous in half the inns between the narrow sea and the Trident. You'd bite the hound if he tried for your throat." She did not smile back. "You would have me, Robert," she said. "You would have me because you want me, and because it would look right with the antlers and the sea and the kegs and the roaring. And you would have me because you hate to lose. But you have not asked the thing I need you to ask." She rubbed her hands together. A faint mark on the left index betrayed where a bowstring had once kissed the skin. Robert knew that mark. He had seen it on boys. He had never thought to see it on the girl he wanted. He shrugged helplessly. "What do you need me to ask, Lya?" "Ask me what I want," she said. "Ask me as if you are not the biggest man in the room. Ask me as if it might cost you to hear it." She glanced back once at Eddard, then straightened as if scolding herself for seeking comfort. Robert felt his throat tighten. The sea murmured in his bones. There were a dozen men in the hall who were pretending not to watch while pretending to watch. He set both hands on the table and spread his fingers. The scars across his knuckles had paled over the years. They made his hands look like maps. "What do you want?" he asked. "Tell me. If it's a thing a man can do, I will do it." "I want the world not to be carved into pieces," she said. Then, more simply, "I want not to be the knife they use to cut it. If I wed you, Robert, the North comes south, and the South thinks the North is here to be remade. If I wed the prince, the North fears it has been sold. I would have none sold. I would have a bridge that is not torn up when a new wind blows." Her mouth softened. "I want to ride and to speak my mind in a hall that listens. I want not to be smothered in a bed I did not choose. I want to feel pride when I look at my father and my brothers. I want to be heard singing and not merely be sung about." Robert closed his eyes for a heartbeat. Then he opened them and nodded. "I hear you," he said. "Gods, I hear you." He forced his voice steady. "I love you. I'll not pretend otherwise. If you say no to me, I'll look at my hands and they'll be empty, and I'll live with it. Tell me plain. Do you want him?" She did not hesitate. "I want what he says he wants," she said. "If he means it. When he crowned me with flowers at Harrenhal, he made a show of meaning. But flowers are cheap in a hall full of men. What does he mean in a hall empty of witnesses? Does he mean it when he speaks to himself?" She looked down. "I cannot say what I feel about the prince yet. It would be dishonest. I did not expect my life to be bent toward a song or a plan. I expected to be wrestled into something I could bear and then find ways to be myself inside it." He wrote differently. "Now I must think differently or else I am a fool." Robert nodded again. He had known this would be hard. It was worse than he had imagined, only in the way of things that are worth the hardness. "And if I bless it?" he asked. He kept his eyes on the table. The grain made little flows like rivers in drought. "If I say, 'Go on then, and may you have all you asked,' will you have him?" She slid from the step to the floor and came to stand before him, small and upright and wearing the air of someone who would not say thank you to a man who had set her free because being free was not his to give. "If you bless it," she said, "I will know you loved me enough to want my wish, and then I will go and test his truth. If he is truthless, he will find the North colder than he expected." The dog under the bench sighed and thumped its tail once as if the hall had agreed upon something and the animal sensed the shift. John Aaron spoke then, and his voice was the voice of a man who had spent a lifetime pouring oil on water without mistaking oil for water. "We will send for the prince," he said. "We will ask him to meet us on ground that belongs to none and to all." "Where?" asked Robert, grateful for the doing that followed, declaring. Eddard's eyes flickered to the window where the sky was now a slate lid on the day. "The Isle of Faces," he said. "If the green men still haunt it, they may like a secret better than a show. And if they do not haunt it, it is a place we remember together. Reed will take us." Lyanna's mouth tightened at that name and then eased. "He will," she said. "He owes me the courtesy of a story told openly." Robert watched her and felt the ache in his ribs shift into a kind of clean hollow. There was room in it for respect. He had always known she was not a tame thing. He had loved her partly for that. Now he must love her and let her be not his. They wrote that night, the hall's braziers glowing dull as old embers and the ink chilling fast in the well. Eddard's hand was neat, each letter like a small, precise carving. John Aaron's was long and slightly slanted, competent and unemotional. Robert scrawled his name like a blade, the last stroke a flourish that he had never managed to tame. They sealed the letters. A raven launched itself before dawn with a soft, chaotic clatter and was swallowed by the gray. Rhaegar received the letter 2 days later in the rookery above the Red Keep's eastern wall, where the air flowed through the arrow slits and smelled of droppings and the distant salt of the bay. He had gone up into that cold chamber because his mind was noisy and he needed the messy silence of birds to speak over. When he broke the seal and read the first line, his shoulders dropped a fraction. When he finished, he set the parchment on the sill so that wan light could make visible what ink insisted. He put his fingertips to the words as if to test their warmth. Arthur Dane leaned against the rough wall near the stairs. His cloak swung back. He had the stillness of men who are mostly muscle but do not need to prove it. His hair shone white as sun on a blade. The sword on his back was sheathed. He had not slept much. No one in the Red Keep had slept much lately, not with the king's moods flooding the corridors as unpredictably as rats. Well? Arthur asked. He did not push. He did not need to. Rhaegar brought him confidences like a wounded man brings his arm to the friend who can bind it. They consent, Rhaegar said. No trumpets, no banners, no insults. They ask to meet on the island in God's eye. Arthur's brows twitched. Howland Reed's country, he said. And we remember Harrenhal is not far. Everything is not far, Rhaegar said, and he said it as if it were a comfort. This is what I wanted, to put my desire on a table where men could touch it and see it, not in a song among candles. Arthur let that sit. Elia? Rhaegar turned then, and his face, which could be remote as the moon at court, was all life's complicated expressions at once. Elia first, he said. Always Elia first. Sunspear in late autumn smelled of dust and oranges. The sweet skins piled in baskets along the market lanes, the flesh bright as lanterns. Elia Martell read the letter in the upper room where the shade made patterns on the floor through the shutters and the children's voices came up from the courtyard like birds' cries. Her nurse had braided her hair in a simple coil at the nape of her neck, and even in the heat she wore a light shawl because the chill that lived in her bones never entirely left. She finished the letter and folded it very carefully and put it back in the pouch. You knew he would, Oberyn said, sprawled in a chair with his boots on a low stool. He had a way of lounging that somehow looked like poising. His eyes were half-lidded and lethal with amusement. He has been living toward it since he put flowers on that girl's head. He thinks himself subtle as a spider, but he is just a man who stares at the thing he wants until men bring it to him to get him to blink. Elia smiled a little at that. He thinks himself a healer, she said. He will try to fix what is not fixed by law. It is a mad, sweet notion. She rubbed her thumb once across the parchment. He tells me he will keep my place. He tells me my children will not be loosed from the Paris. He asks me to trust his balance. And will you? Oberyn rolled one of the oranges under the arch of his foot, trapping it with his toes. Shall I sharpen the viper's tongue or the viper's tooth? Both? Neither. Elia looked at the window where a strip of blue burned, unbothered by clouds. She had long since learned the shape of her limits. She knew the ache behind her knee that meant she would not run down the stairs without stopping to catch at the rail. She knew the way her breath shortened if she hurried. She knew, with clarity so clean it hurt, that Rhaegar loved her and loved something else. His idea of mankind, perhaps, or a song that he heard under men's clatter. She knew he did not lie. He often did not see, but he did not lie. I will be a queen not made smaller by another queen, she said. I will ask him to promise me that with deeds, not poetry. I will ask that the Martells be honored for the honor we show. I will ask that the girl be not caged in silk and that I be not thrown into shadow. She tilted her head. And I will ask my brother to keep his swords sheathed for as long as he can." Oberyn stood, in one liquid movement, and came to kiss her brow. "For you," he said, "I would unstring the sun." "For me," she replied, "you will drink less tonight and write a letter to our mother that does not make her fear." Rhaegar went to Sunspear. He walked with Elia under the pergola where the grapes hung pale gold, and they did not speak of the letter at first. They spoke of Aegon's stubbornness about his letters and Rhaenys' tenderness for a stray cat who had taken to sleeping in her bed. They spoke of the little tower in the red keep that Elia loved, with its latticework window that snared breezes, and how he might build one like it in the court facing the north if the walls did not mind. Elia's hand in his was cool and slightly damp. She had a pulse in the wrist like a small wing. When they spoke of the letter, Rhaegar's voice did not break and Elia's did not tremble. They were old lovers beyond such theater. She told him plainly what she wanted: authority named, rights affirmed, her children's precedents written not in a poet's quill but in the ink of the law. He told her plainly what he intended: a ceremony that did not require the faith sanction so as not to put her honor in their jeopardy, a vow before the old gods who did not care about polygamy because they cared about different things. "Bring her to me," Elia said at last. "I would know her fear and her firmness. If I can stand in a room with her and breathe, I will know I can stand in rooms with her for the rest of my life." Rhaegar kissed her hands and promised it would be so. He went back to King's Landing lighter than he had come and into a court that grew darker by the day. Aerys II wore his hair longer than fashion and his nails longer than any use required. He was a thin man with a mouth that had almost learned to smile long ago and then forgot the last lesson. He loved his pyromancers and despised cleanliness. When Rhaegar went into the throne room to speak to him, Varys the eunuch moved like a soft shadow along the wall, and Pycelle's beard brushed his own belly in the bow he made. The air smelled faintly of what everyone pretended not to smell: the oil of wildfire somewhere, open in a brazier, for the pyromancers liked to test and to watch. Rhaegar bent his head and said "father" in a voice that asked a father to answer as a father. Aerys rolled the word on his tongue and then let it drop. "You ask to break the law of the faith," the king said. He loved to say no. It nourished him. He was starving for it most days and so took long drinks when he could. "You ask to make a northern girl a second wife. You ask me to stir the Martells and the Seven and the waiting mouths of lords who are bored." He smiled then, a flash of a thing that showed his teeth. "You ask and you bring me Robert Baratheon's praise to sweeten it. Why should I not spit?" Rhaegar had learned not to talk more than the king liked. He had learned to use silence to shape the room. He stood and let the roar of blood in his ears settle. Let the king exhaust the store of words he liked to throw like skins over meat to hide it from inspection. "Because this binds the north to us," he said when the silence was just long enough to be respectful and not long enough to be insolent. "Because the boy who will be born of it may serve the winter that will come. Because the girl who will be born of it may not be a subject of any one god and thus will not be an enemy to any." Aerys' laugh was dry. "Winter, you and your winter. I have burned men and air and I have watched a man melt inside his armor," he said mildly. "Your winter is a tale to frighten children so they will eat turnips. Varys, is it not so? Tell the prince it is so." "Winter is a cycle, your grace," Varys murmured. He had a voice like a hand stroking fur the right way. "But the north is a cycle of men. They become dangerous when they think nobody remembers them. One might say the prince is thinking of danger and dress both." The king hissed, delighted. He was a cat and the sound suited him. "Dress? Yes. We will dress it so the faith cannot see its nakedness. Perform your nonsense at the Isle of Faces and call it old. Yes. Let the old gods dine. Varys will carry bread to them. I shall forbid a septon to go within 100 miles. And then I shall forbid the faith to notice. Pycelle will bring me 10 letters explaining how I am kind." Pycelle's beard trembled. "Your grace." Aerys ignored him and turned his head, fascinated as always with his son's face when it was held still by a desire stronger than any other desire. "Marry the girl," he said. "Marry her in a marsh. Bring her back and see if Elia bites her." He looked almost merry, for madness has moods that mimic joy. "Then watch the lords boil. I will warm my hands." Rhaegar bowed. He did not look at Varys because he knew that if he looked he would see in the eunuch's eyes not approval or disapproval, but the kind of watching that never stopped working. When he left the hall, the sound of the sea seemed very far away. In its place was the whisper of dry things: brooms, parchment, silk. He went to his small chamber and took up his harp and tuned it very slowly. Lyanna rode south with her brother and with Howland Reed, who appeared at Winterfell like a man who steps out of a story into the room and hopes not to be examined too closely. He was slight and quick and looked perpetually like a man listening to things no one else could hear. He rode a patient pony the color of peat and wore a cap made of something green that might have been water weeds if water weeds could be woven. "The island is not always where it looks," he told them, almost apologetic, as if the fault lay with him. "It's a trick of the eye. The lake is full of pieces, and the pieces move. But the way is marked for those who have been taught." Lyanna felt alive from the toes to the scalp. The further they went from Winterfell, the louder everything became. Frogs in the marshes with their obscene chorus, birds arguing in the reeds, unseen things plunging into water and making rings that widened and widened until the surface forgot them. The smell was of peat and rot and green growth and a sweetness like apples left on a windowsill too long. Her brother rode a little ahead. When she lagged, he glanced back with the old fond worry that had not made him a better rider but had made him a better man. "Are you ready?" he asked her that night when they had made camp on a dry hummock and Reed had set about making a fire that would not send smoke where smoke would not be safe. "No," Lyanna said. She smiled into the flames so he would not see it unless he looked directly. "But then I would be suspicious of myself if I were. Ready would mean I have rehearsed and rehearsed. I do not want to arrive with a speech. I want to arrive with a mind." Eddard grunted. It was the closest he came to teasing her. "You always do." The Isle of Faces stood green against the green water, and yet it could not be mistaken. The trees were older than the wind. Their leaves made a whisper that had a timbre no other leaves could manage, the way an old woman's song carries history in the cracked notes. Their pale trunks were scarred with faces carved so long ago that the wood had grown around the cuts and made them seem alive. The island smelled of sap and cold iron, of wet earth and a strange clean scent that Lyanna would later decide was memory. There were men there, or things like men, moving silently as if they had been born from the island's roots. They did not speak. They watched with a stillness that was not hostile but not indulgent either. Howland Reed greeted them with a slight bow and a string of words in a language Lyanna did not know and did not ask to learn at once because learning would have felt like presumption. Rhaegar came up the narrow plank that the rivermen had laid, Arthur Dane behind him with two others of the white cloak who stepped as if the plank were a marble stair and nothing to cause the heart to lurch. Rhaegar wore no crown and no cape and no jewel. He wore a dark tunic and the look of a man who has left something important behind but knows he will return to it. When he saw Lyanna he stopped, and for a moment all the noise of frogs and wind and water took a polite step away from the meeting. They bowed. Someone murmured names, for courtesy's sake, but the names were unnecessary. The faces knew. "It is good to meet you here," Rhaegar said. "The place keeps men honest." Lyanna lifted her chin. "Then let us be honest," she said. She slid her hand into Eddard's without thinking, felt his surprised squeeze, and then withdrew it. She spoke and the island listened. Reed said later that the island always listened when someone meant to tell the truth, and Lyanna had meant to tell the truth so hard that it was like leaping into cold water. She told Rhaegar what she wanted and what she would not accept. She told him that her life was not a cause to him, even if causes were what made his heart race. She told him she would stand with him if he could stand next to Elia and not make one woman into another's shadow. She told him that the north would not be melted down for the south's shape, and that if he wanted any man from east of the neck to remember what it was to be old and new at once, then he must carry his harp to small halls as well as great ones and listen to songs as well as sing them. She told him these things and more and then said nothing and looked at his face. Rhaegar listened. He listened with the attention he usually reserved for music, for the way a line moved and then resolved. When she finished, he did not reply immediately. He looked up at the faces cut into the heart trees and seemed to be measuring his own shape against their muteness. Then he said, "I will tell you something I did not intend to tell you. I will tell you the thing that makes fools of men with good sense. I think I know we will need you. I feel it like a draft under a door. I do not know the exact form of it. I am not so arrogant as to say prophecy. I say only that the world grows thin in places, and we must knit it with more than law. Will you help me knit it?" Lyanna's first impulse was laughter, and she laughed, and that moved the leaves in a way that made an old face look briefly surprised. "You ask me to knit," she said. "I who have never held a needle long." Her voice gentled. "I will help you, but I will set my pattern as well as yours." Eddard felt something a knot inside him. He exhaled and tasted water on the air. Robert Baratheon stepped forward then, and the movement was an ache. He had come because he had promised. He had listened because he owed her that. Now he set his hand out to the man he had wanted to hate cleanly. "Take her," he essayed. "ID," and he was astonished to find his voice clear. "Take her as she is and not as you imagine her. I give you my blessing. Costs me and I pay it. Keep what I pay from being spent upon foolishness." Rhaegar bowed his head. "I hear," he said, and it was not a court reply. It had content. Then he did a strange thing. He stepped aside and looked to Elia, who appeared from between two trees as if she had been there all along, because she had. The men in white had moved their weight once to let her pass, and her footsteps had been so careful that the frogs decided not to stop. Elia came and set her hand in Lyanna's because she had asked to feel that touch before any other to see if it made her breath catch out of jealousy or ease out of recognition. The island waited. The gods, who were older than the faith and perhaps less domesticated, waited. "Will you honor me?" Elia asked, her voice paradoxically both dry and sweet, the sound of a southern spring's first day of intolerable heat and its relief at dusk. "Will you honor the children I bore? Will you let me be first where I am first and not seek to make me small?" Lyanna did not know how to say yes without saying too much. She said it simply, "Yes." She looked into Elia's eyes and saw a person with careful manners and hard-earned softness. "And will you honor me? Will you let me be wild where I must and still think me a woman?" she asked. Elia smiled then, and there was the steel of a thin blade in it. A blade easy to underestimate because its hilt was wrapped in silk. "I have always honored women who are what they are," she said. "We will teach our men together." The ceremony was not like any septon's bustle. It involved no long recitations. It involved a silence that longed to heal. The old faces watched. Howland Reed spoke the ancient words as he had learned them, and Eddard and Robert and Jon Arryn stood witness, and Arthur Dayne watched the air as if for a sign that would make his duty simpler. Rhaegar and Lyanna laid their hands on the heart tree and spoke the words that felt most theirs. Elia touched the tree too, and her hand was steady. Rhaegar promised with a voice that grew stronger as he spoke, as if he were discovering that his promises created a road under his feet where he had only imagined one. When it was done, the wind rose briefly as if someone had sighed from a great height. Leaves turned their pale bellies to the light and then settled themselves again like birds in a hedge. The men and women on the island did not cheer. They did not need to. The silence had weight and approval. Reed smiled, a quick arrow of a thing. Robert turned away and went down to the water's edge and stood looking at the reflection of the trees rippling. Lyanna went to him. She stood beside him, and for a time neither spoke. The water had scum at the edges and a glassy beauty in the middle. It showed her the shape of her jaw and the black of her hair. Robert shifted, and when he looked at her, his eyes were wet. He had never cried where she could see him. It made her hand lift and then drop. "This was right," he said. He said it a little too strongly, as if he were speaking to someone who needed convincing, probably himself. "He is not what I am." He laughed shortly. "He is a better liar to himself and a worse liar to others." Lyanna blew air from her nose, amused despite herself. "You will marry," she said. He groaned. "Do not begin, girl. Not tonight. Let me be tragic for one night." She bumped his shoulder with hers, hard enough that his balance protested. "You are too large for tragedy," she said. "It would have to be a tragedy in a barn and with 3 barrels of ale." They stood like that a while, and then Robert took a breath that lifted his big body and set it down again. "For the realm, then," he said, and his voice found its old boom. "If I must say a noble thing, let it be that. For the realm. For yourself," Lyanna corrected, and left him to make of that what he could. They went back to King's Landing with the wind in their cloaks and the early frosts following their horses like shy white dogs. The city took them in with its accustomed clatter. Fishwives scolding, merchants flirting with each other's customers, thieves measuring sleeves for slackness. The Red Keep was as it had always been, and yet nothing in it felt quite the same. Lyanna's presence made the corridors taller. Elia's acceptance made the courtiers furious and hopeful in equal measure. The kitchens seethed with gossip that bubbled and spattered. Even the scullions had opinions. Varys adjusted himself to the new arrangement faster than anyone whose hair did not gray overnight because he did not burden his mind with preference. He visited Lyanna with a gift of sugared lemon and a story about the market near the Dragon Gate where the best carp could be had for those with humble tastes. He spoke as if he spoke to a sister he valued. When he left, Lyanna said to Elia, "He is dangerous." And Elia said, "Everything is dangerous here. He is a man who enjoys danger the way boys enjoy climbing." The High Septon sent a letter that smelled of incense and injured righteousness. It protested in veiled language and asked for clarification in phrases that meant no. Pycelle read it out with great dignity and greater beard. Rhaegar drafted a reply himself. He wrote of the ancient practice of the royal house in older times. He wrote of the legality of vows made before the old gods. He wrote of the peace in the realm and the poor in Flea Bottom, as if reminding the High Septon of his duty might encourage him to perform it. He sent the letter and steeled himself. The reply that came spoke of patience and disappointment and ended with a minor threat dressed like a benediction. The king laughed until he coughed, which took the merriment out of the room. If the faith ground its teeth, Dorne bared its teeth. Letters flew from Sunspear to King's Landing and back, and each was a lesso. And in the art of saying yes and no with equal courtesy. Elia herself composed several, and Oberyn, when he deigned to put ink to paper rather than letting wine do his talking, composed 2 that had to be burned because they were too brilliant to be safe. Alia Sand, a cousin who had wit like a thorn and a memory like a lock, came to court and began at once to gather around herself a small company of women who played Syvass with the kind of quiet that made men's hair rise. The North sent a delegation to settle the practicalities. Wyman Manderley arrived with a smile like a larder and a ledger under his arm and spoke long to the Master of Coin about ships and grain. The Karstarks sent a second son who had the solemn air of a mastiff allowed inside for the first time. Old Bear Mormont did not come, but his daughter's daughter did, a girl who wore a dagger she had been told not to wear and looked as if she would use it if needed. They made demands that the Southern Lords found rude and the Northern Lords found insufficient. In time, those demands condensed into something like an agreement, and that agreement was called, for lack of a better term, the Charter of Warmth, as if men thought naming a thing warmly would keep it from growing cold. The Charter promised that the North's laws would be respected in the North, that their gods would not be mocked in public by mouthy courtiers, that harvest tithes could be altered when winter ran too long, that forest rights would be enforced against those who thought a lord had a right to any tree his eyes could see. In return, the North promised that its men would ride when called and that its lords would send a certain number of boys and girls to foster at court, to learn Southern ways and befriend Southern hearts. If the court would send an equal number north to be taught how to walk on snow without breaking through crust. In private, Lyanna watched the small things. She stood on the balcony that looked toward the sea and noted the gulls' angles and the way the fishermen's wives called to one another at dusk. She learned the names of 5 serving women and the names of their children, and remembered to ask for their news. She learned where the stones on the stair were chipped and which chip made using that stair barefoot a fool's idea. She found the godswood and went there not too often, because men observed her now, and she did not want the place to become a stage for their observation. The pool was black and still, the trees old but not old like the ones on the island. She touched one and thanked it for its dullness. Dullness. in a life of bright noise, was mercy. Elia and Lyanna discovered the way to move together through a corridor, so that gossip had to change its direction twice in the space of 20 paces and thus became dizzy. They learned to sit in a window recess where the light was kind to both of them, and to leave a space between their knees when they sat that felt like respect rather than a wound. They found a way to share the care of young Rhaenys for 3 hours each afternoon, when her energy could be directed toward projects that did not require climbing. They did not speak often of their shared husband because they did not need to. It would have brought into the room the kind of comparison that women are always forced to make. They spoke of women most often, of mothers who had died or lived too long, of a girl who had looked at Elia the day before with envy so large it was nearly pity, of a woman in the city who had set up a table in the market where she bound wounds and refused payment from women, of how to put honey in a tea so that it soothed rather than cloyed, of what one did with a fear that woke one at dawn. Rhaegar, who had always moved like a man trying to step around a puddle of invisible water, took to the new arrangement with the same earnestness with which he had taken to everything he had ever loved. He visited the training yard and made Robert laugh like thunder when he proved himself not useless with a spear. He visited the tailor and endured being measured for a simpler robe that would not snag on a harp string. He wrote a small tune that he played for the children at dusk because Rhaenys had asked for a song about a fish, and men in the yard found their conversation interrupted by a melody that made them grunt and then become quiet. At court, the men who had wanted war with Robert now wanted war with someone else. Tywin Lannister wrote no letter but watched and stacked his watchfulness like coins. Mace Tyrell sent flowers and a cousin with eyebrows that made ladies giggle. The Tullis smiled and talked of rivers and alliances. The Greyjoys sent nothing. The Arryns whispered respect to their falcons and fed them bits of rabbit. The realm gathered itself like a cloak around a thin man in winter, not warmly, but with intent to keep living. Varys brought news to Rhaegar that the faith had begun to murmur about the danger of precedent. He brought quieter news that there were modest men in brown robes tending to the poorest who did not care who married whom as long as the baker did not double the price of yesterday's bread. He brought a name, a septon near the mud gate who had preached a sermon so tender about wives that a fruit seller had wept into her apron. Rhaegar went in plain clothes and listened, and then went away again and wrote in his diary a line that embarrassed him for its childishness: that men sometimes love the good when they see it. The king watched all this with a hunger that had nothing to do with food. He enjoyed the way people flinched when they passed his door. He was more fascinated than angered by the way his son had made the city into a machine of motion that somehow ran even when the king's own impulses were to jam it. He visited the pyromancers and brought back to the hall a jar of fluid that he set on the dais and looked at as if it were capable of answering him. Once he lifted the jar and tilted it and set it down again as if testing its willingness to stay put. That autumn passed like a slow song. The days shortened and the sun learned to touch the city sideways. Lyanna found the hour at which her breath made a little silver cloud in the garden, and began to go there then because watching one's breath is like watching one's soul keep its contract with the world. She trained with a bow in a guarded way when she could convince Roderick Castle to stand with her. She asked the Master of Laws questions that made his clerks shiver with happiness because the questions were the questions of a person who expects an answer she can use. She went to Flea Bottom twice, with Elia once and with a small retinue once, and the second time she did not faint at the smell. She came home with a child's handprint on her skirt, which she did not have washed out until the next day. There was not peace. There were not clean lines. Elia woke one morning with pain in her joints and did not leave her chamber. Lyanna sat with her and talked until the pain was less, and then they both slept sitting up like old women. A lord from the Rock said a thing at dinner that would have been a joke if he had been less cowardly. Lyanna said nothing that night and then said everything the next day in a letter to Wyman Manderley asking for a certain expert in the laws of forest rights. Rhaegar lost his temper once with a groom who had left a horse sore-backed. He apologized and then went down to the stables 2 days later and apologized again, and the world did not end. Robert rode back to Storm's End with 4 barrels of wine and 2 good songs stuck in his head and a certain lightness, and then hunted until he was tired enough to let sleep come fast. He sent Lyanna a letter that was 3 lines long and contained only one joke, and that joke was about himself. The winter roses opened in a garden where the climate had been coaxed under glass and man's will. Lyanna plucked one and set it in a cup of water by the window. In the mornings it looked as if frost had been breathed onto its petals, and in the afternoons the frost melted and one could see the faint bruises where the stem had been cut. She did not speak of the symbolism to anyone because she trusted no symbol entirely. She trusted the moments where people did what they did because they had decided to and had to live with what came of it. When the first snow fell in the city, astonished children put out their tongues and learned the taste of sky. The wind went down the alleys with a sound like a knife on cloth. The bakers worked harder. A woman at the corner of a square huddled under a blanket that had already had 2 owners before it had hers. Lyanna sent blankets. Elia sent men to carry the blankets into the right rooms. Rhaegar stood on a balcony with both women and watched the flakes dissolve into the black water far below. "Will this hold?" Elia asked, not looking at either of them but at the flakes' small, stubborn insistence on being individual even as they fell into each other and became water together. It was not the kind of question one answers easily. "It will hold until it does not," Lyanna said. She put her hand on the stone. "What we do now may not prevent the breaking, but it may make the mending shorter." Rhaegar looked at them both and felt a responsibility that made his joints feel older. Responsibility is a weight, and it can either bend a man or strengthen his back. He did not know which it would do to him. He only knew that the sound of the snow was a sound he had not known before, and that he would have to learn it the way he learned all music, by listening longer than was comfortable and then imitating what he heard until his hands obeyed. Down in Flea Bottom, a knife went into a man's belly because the man had moved a line of chalk 12 inches in the night to try to steal 2 feet of market space. In a room near the September of Baelor, the High Septon whispered to a circle of men that the realm was watching to see whether sin brought happiness. In a room without windows, Varys placed a small carved token on a corner of a map and then nudged it a finger's width, the way a man nudges a chess piece when he wants to see if moving it pleasingly rearranges the board. In the dungeons, a rat ate a bit of bread and felt the ache in its gut and thought only of the next bite. In the hall, the king took off his shoe and threw it at a page because the boy had sighed where sighing was not allowed. Life is not one thing. It is 100 and then another 100. The wedding beneath the faces had not silenced the sea. It had not sealed the mouths of those who fed on whispering. It had not cured the king or melted Tywin's gold or taught some mannered fool from Old Town to judge his own measures. It had done what such moments do. It had made a place where truth could rest for a time and know it would not be unseated by lie before morning. That night, Lyanna could not sleep. She rose and put on a cloak and padded barefoot to the Godswood, where the pool was skinning over with a thin, fragile ice. The moon made the ice luminous. It did not make it less thin. She crouched and watched her breath cloud, and then she put her palm flat on the ice and left a print that persisted for the space of 3 heartbeats and was gone. She whispered, not to any god, but to the cold air, which is a god in its way. "I will not be a foolish girl," she told the cold. "I will not mistake a man's need for a world's. I will not mistake a world's need for my own." She looked up. The branches, lace of black on white, made a frame. In the frame she could see only a small slice of sky, but it was enough. When she went back, Rhaegar was at his harp. He did not play at night when others slept, not often, because music came into people's dreams and he did not like to move his friends' dreams around without permission. Tonight he played something that sounded like ice making up its mind. To be strong. Lyanna sat and listened. Elia came in after a time, wrapped in a shawl that smelled of oranges, and took the other chair and did what she always did when she listened. She watched the musician's hands as if the hands were separate creatures and needed attention. Robert wrote a letter with a blunt quill and a stub of candle to light him. He wrote of bore and wind and the absurdity of a storm that had decided to hang off the cape and frighten no one but sailors. He wrote the name Lyanna and then scratched it out and wrote girl and then scratched it out and wrote you, which was not better but was not worse. He lifted the paper and blew on it and shook his head at himself and took a swig from a cup that had water in it for once. He laughed aloud because no one was there. He slept better than he had in months. John Aaron climbed a stair and felt his knees protest and put his palm flat on the cool of the wall and remembered 2 boys who had become 2 men and 1 girl who had become, not a woman exactly, but herself. He thought that perhaps he might be allowed to die one day knowing his students had made their own judgments without becoming cruel. One hopes small as one ages because small hopes are the ones that can be fulfilled. The snow fell. The sea went on speaking because it never does not speak, even on the rare days it seems to rest. The city began to decide what it would become under this new arrangement. Some made a business of the decision. Some made poetry. Some made knives. Rhaegar and Elia and Lyanna and Eddard and Robert and the rest stood in their places and learned the new sounds of the realm the way one learns to live in a house whose beams creak oddly. The noise that means danger, the noise that means merely the house telling you it is there. And the king, who should have been the one to say when to stop and when to go, lay in his bed one afternoon with his hair uncombed and his mouth full of the taste of copper from a bleeding gum and dreamed of a city that burned and of the joy of the burning. He woke hungry. He called for honey cakes. He ate 2 and smeared honey on his thumb and licked it and said to the empty air, "We will see." He said it as if to himself, because in the end a man who loves fire has only himself to speak to. He smiled, and the smile had no meaning anyone could rely on. At dusk, Lyanna walked the wall with Eddard. The air was knife-cold and sweet, and they spoke of 2 things only: the smell of smoke from braziers on the lower terraces, and their father, whose letters had shortened since spring, because old men's words become expensive. They did not speak of war. They did not speak of winter as prophecy. They did not speak of how many people were needed to carry a city through a year. Eddard stopped and put his hand on her shoulder. His hand was as it had been when she was small, and he had caught her collar to keep her from running into the stable yard when the carriage came in. She felt the deep relief in that. "We will do what we can do," he said. She nodded without looking at him. "We will," she said. "And when we cannot, we will ask the old trees to remember for us that we meant to." They stood, and the night took the color out of everything except flame. Below them, in the city, a slattern in a green shawl laughed like a bell, and someone answered her with a whistle, and a man cried to the sky because he had found something he had not expected to lose. The gulls wheeled. The first star sharpened and then softened and then disappeared behind cloud. The snow settled into a habit. In the prince's chamber, the harp strings stopped vibrating a long time after his fingers ceased to pluck them. Silence does not come when you demand it. It comes when what needed to be said has been said well enough to rest. Rhaegar set the instrument in its case and drew the cloth over it the way a man draws a blanket over a sleeping child. He looked over his shoulder. Elia had fallen asleep in the chair, her head bent to one side. The shawl slipped. Lyanna looked as if she could sit another hour and simply watch. He moved to put the shawl back and did it as carefully as he had played. "There will be shrines made of patience and fury before this is done," Lyanna said. "We should build the first quietly." He nodded. He went to the window and opened it. Cold entered with the clean stealth of poverty. He breathed it and let it hollow him a little and then fill that hollow with something not unpleasant. Something like resolve that did not taste of iron but of pine. In Flea Bottom, the woman at the market who bound wounds took a needle and went to work on a cut hand. "Hold still," she told the boy. "Men in silks are doing what they can. We will do ours." The boy stared at the needle and fell in love with her, briefly, as boys do. She wrapped the hand and tied the knot with a tug. "Off with you," she said. "Fetch bread. Bring me a piece." He ran. The snow took his footprints and made them into small truths that lasted a little while and then not at all. No trumpet announced the new arrangement to the heavens. No comet burned. No line in a book of prophecies turned from black to red. A man put another log on a fire. A woman set out 2 cups instead of 1. A lord changed the way his steward tallied a tax. A child learned that a fish has bones. The sea struck and struck and struck, not as a warning or as applause, but because it is the sea, and that is what it knows how to do. In such ways do realms turn, so slowly that one could live a whole life and think nothing had changed, so quickly that a single night can upend 1,000 habits. The city slept, or pretended to, and in the deepest watch the snow found all the flat surfaces and softened them. Dawn would come. Men would tell themselves stories about the day. The marriage on the island would become one of those stories, told either as audacity or as prudence, used either to prop up one man's ambit, Ion or another's regret. But for now it was simply what two had done before a tree that had watched men make and unmake vows since before such songs had words. Lyanna woke before the sun and went down into the courtyard and stood with her face lifted to the pale beginning of light, the kind of light that looks like someone is thinking about mercy. She closed her eyes and saw the island again, saw Elia's steady hand and Rhaegar's serious mouth and Robert's grim gift, Eddard's slender endurance, Howland's quick smile. She thought, we have made something. It will not be what we intended. It will be itself. She opened her eyes and became ready to meet it as it came.